This is the kind of person who changes the entire emotional atmosphere of a relationship, not because they become colder, more distant, or less caring, but because they finally understand the difference between love and self-abandonment. For a long time, many people believe that loving someone means constantly proving their devotion. They believe love is measured by how much they can tolerate, how much they can forgive, how much they can sacrifice, and how far they are willing to stretch themselves to keep another person comfortable. But there is a hidden danger in this kind of love. When you repeatedly ignore your own needs to protect someone else's emotions, you may believe you are creating security. In reality, you may be creating an imbalance where one person becomes responsible for carrying the emotional weight of the entire connection. No matter how much emotional exhaustion they experience. But there is a difference between loving someone and losing yourself inside the process of loving them. Love is meant to be an expression of who you are, not a replacement for who you are. The person who learns to love without losing themselves reaches a point where they realize something important. Their heart deserves protection too. They can care about someone's struggles without becoming responsible for fixing every wound. They can understand someone's fears without allowing those fears to dictate their own emotional reality. They can offer kindness without constantly sacrificing their own peace. This creates a completely different kind of presence. Before this transformation, a person may approach love from a place of fear. They may constantly wonder how to keep the connection alive, how to avoid triggering distance, how to say the perfect thing, or how to become someone who will finally be chosen. Their focus becomes centered around the other person's reactions. They start monitoring messages, analyzing silence, searching for hidden meanings, and adjusting themselves to maintain closeness. Slowly, without realizing it, they begin making themselves smaller. They silence their needs. They ignore their discomfort. They accept uncertainty because they fear losing the person more than they fear losing themselves. But the moment they learn to love without self-abandonment, everything changes. They stop asking, "How do I convince this person to stay?" And they begin asking, "Is this person capable of meeting me where I am?" That question represents a powerful emotional shift, because healthy love is not built on one person constantly reaching while the other person constantly retreats. It requires two people who are willing to participate, communicate, and grow. Someone who has learned to love themselves does not become emotionally unavailable. They do not stop caring. They do not become cruel or indifferent. They simply stop confusing love with endless sacrifice. They understand that a relationship should add to their life, not require them to disappear from it. This is often what makes them different from the people an avoidant partner may have encountered before. An avoidant person may be familiar with emotional extremes. They may know what it feels like when someone becomes overwhelmed by their distance, when someone tries harder every time they pull away, or when someone takes full responsibility for maintaining the connection. But someone who has found emotional balance responds differently. They do not chase every withdrawal. They do not panic every time space appears. They do not interpret distance as a challenge they must overcome. Instead, they remain grounded. They allow the other person to have their feelings while also honoring their own. This can create a powerful realization because the relationship dynamic changes completely. The avoidant partner can no longer rely on the other person carrying all the emotional effort. They can no longer disappear and return to find everything exactly as they left it. They encounter someone who is loving but not endlessly available without reciprocity. Someone who is understanding, but not willing to ignore their own needs. Someone who is patient, but not waiting forever. This type of love creates a different kind of safety. It shows that closeness does not have to mean losing freedom. It shows that intimacy does not require one person to sacrifice their identity. It shows that two people can be connected while still remaining whole individuals. The person who learns to love without losing themselves also stops trying to control another person's healing journey. They understand that they cannot force someone to become vulnerable. They cannot convince someone to face their fears. They cannot love someone into emotional readiness. Growth has to be chosen from within. And accepting this truth is one of the most freeing moments a person can experience, because it allows them to love without carrying a responsibility that was never theirs. They can say, "I care about you, but I cannot do your healing for you. I understand your fears, but I cannot allow them to destroy my peace. I want connection, but I also want a relationship where both people show up." This is not a lack of love, it is a more mature form of love, a love that does not come from desperation, a love that does not beg to be chosen, a love that exists because two people freely decide to meet each other. The person who learns to love without losing themselves becomes powerful because their sense of worth is no longer controlled by another person's attention. They no longer need constant reassurance to believe they matter. They no longer collapse when someone creates distance. They no longer measure their value by how hard someone fights to keep them. They know their worth exists before anyone else recognizes it. And ironically, this is often the type of person who creates the greatest emotional impact. Not because they are trying to make someone chase them, not because they are playing a strategy, but because they are no longer abandoning themselves for connection. Their energy changes, their presence changes, their choices change. They stop coming from fear and start coming from self-respect. And when someone encounters a person who can love deeply while still standing firmly in themselves, they experience something rare. They experience love that does not demand, chase, or disappear. They experience love that simply stands there, whole and complete. That is the person who creates the deepest shift. Not the person who loves the most desperately. The person who loves the most consciously. The person who loves without losing themselves understands that love is not supposed to require the disappearance of their own identity. They can care deeply while still having boundaries. They can be compassionate while still having standards. They can understand someone's fears without allowing those fears to control their entire life. This creates a completely different emotional energy. Instead of approaching the relationship from a place of fear, they approach it from a place of choice. They are not saying, "I need you to stay because I cannot handle losing you." They are saying, "I want you in my life, but I will not destroy myself trying to keep you." That difference is powerful. When someone loves from insecurity, they often become focused on preventing loss. Every delayed message feels threatening. Every moment of distance feels like rejection. Every change in emotion feels like something they must immediately fix. Their attention becomes consumed by the question, how do I make this person choose me? But when someone learns to love without losing themselves, the question changes. They begin asking, is this connection healthy for both of us? Are we both showing up? Does this relationship allow me to be fully myself? This shift changes everything because love stops being a desperate attempt to hold on to someone and becomes a conscious decision between two people. An avoidant partner, especially one who struggles with closeness, may feel the difference immediately. They may be used to relationships where emotional intensity creates pressure, where another person's happiness depends heavily on their actions, or where distance creates a cycle of pursuit and retreat. But someone who has developed emotional security brings something different. They bring steadiness. They do not chase every moment of uncertainty. They do not panic at every sign of space. They do not try to force emotional conversations before the other person is ready. At the same time, they do not tolerate endless inconsistency. They can give someone room without giving away their own peace. This balance can feel unfamiliar because it removes the extremes that often keep unhealthy patterns alive. There is no emotional storm to escape from. There is no endless reassurance to provide. There is no person desperately trying to prove their worth. Instead, there is a calm presence that communicates, I care about you, but I also respect myself. That message can be deeply transformative because it introduces a new model of connection. It shows that intimacy does not have to mean losing freedom. Commitment does not have to mean losing identity. Love does not have to feel like a burden. The person who loves without losing themselves also stops confusing someone's potential with their current behavior. They may see the good in someone. They may understand their wounds. They may recognize why they struggle with vulnerability. But they also understand that understanding someone does not mean accepting everything from them. Compassion without boundaries can become self-neglect. Boundaries without compassion can become walls. The healthiest place exists somewhere in between, a place where love and self-respect can exist together. This is why the deepest shift often happens when someone stops trying to be chosen and starts choosing themselves, not because they no longer care, not because their heart becomes closed, but because their love is no longer controlled by fear. They are no longer offering endless access in exchange for small moments of affection. They are no longer measuring their value by someone's ability to recognize it. They know who they are, whether someone stays or leaves, and that kind of emotional stability changes the entire dynamic. Because when one person stops abandoning themselves, the relationship has to reveal its true nature. The other person either steps forward and meets them with genuine effort, or the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Either way, clarity appears. The person who learns to love without losing themselves does not become less loving. They become more whole. And from that place of wholeness, love becomes something freely given rather than something desperately offered. That is the kind of love that creates the deepest transformation. This is the part many people misunderstand. They believe that if they simply give more love, offer more patience, explain themselves more clearly, or become more understanding, an avoidant partner will finally feel safe enough to open up. They believe their consistency will eventually break through the walls. They believe that if they become the perfect source of comfort, the avoidant will finally stop running. But love does not work like a rescue mission. A person cannot heal another person's fear of intimacy by sacrificing their own emotional needs. They cannot prove someone into becoming emotionally available. They cannot love someone so perfectly that the other person suddenly stops fearing vulnerability. The person who truly changes the dynamic is often the one who stops trying to control the outcome. They are the person who remains caring but no longer desperate. They are emotionally available but no longer endlessly accessible. They offer love, but they do not abandon themselves in the process, and this creates something an avoidant person may rarely experience: a relationship where closeness does not mean losing oneself, and where love does not mean unlimited emotional rescue. An avoidant partner often becomes comfortable in relationships where the emotional balance is uneven. One person pursues, explains, reassures, and repairs, while the other person withdraws, processes, and creates distance. Over time, this creates a familiar pattern. The pursuer becomes more anxious, and the avoidant becomes more distant. Both people end up reinforcing each other's fears. The more one person chases, the more the other feels pressure. The more the avoidant pulls away, the more the other person feels the need to prove their importance. The cycle becomes a loop where both people are reacting rather than connecting, but something changes when one person steps out of that pattern. Not through anger, not through punishment, not through trying to make the other person feel guilty, but through emotional maturity. The person who transforms the dynamic is the one who can say, "I care about you, but I also care about myself." This is a powerful shift, because it removes the emotional pressure that often makes avoidant partners feel trapped, while also removing the safety net that allowed unhealthy patterns to continue. Many avoidant individuals have learned, consciously or unconsciously, that relationships come with overwhelming expectations. They may associate closeness with losing freedom, being controlled, being responsible for another person's emotions, or eventually experiencing disappointment. So when someone approaches them with intense pursuit, constant reassurance, or endless attempts to fix the relationship, their nervous system may interpret that closeness as pressure rather than comfort. But when they encounter someone who has their own identity, their own stability, and their own emotional foundation, the experience becomes different. This person is not asking them to become the entire source of their happiness. They are not saying, "Complete me." They are saying, "I choose you, but I am already whole." That difference changes everything. A secure person does not create safety by begging someone to stay. They create safety by showing that love can exist without fear, control, or desperation. They do not chase every moment of distance. They do not collapse every time someone becomes quiet. They do not interpret every pause as proof that they are unwanted. Instead, they observe. They communicate, they maintain their boundaries, and they allow the other person to take responsibility for their own emotional journey. This can be deeply confronting for an avoidant partner because it removes the familiar dynamic they may have unknowingly depended on. They can no longer measure love by how much someone tolerates. They can no longer confuse endless availability with emotional security. They begin to encounter a person who has compassion without self-abandonment. And that can create a very different emotional experience. The person who truly impacts an avoidant is not the one who disappears to create a reaction. It is not someone who plays games or tries to manipulate distance. It is someone who genuinely grows, someone who becomes less reactive, someone who stops measuring their worth by another person's ability to choose them, someone who understands that love is not about convincing someone to see their value. It is about sharing value with someone who is willing to meet them there. This type of person can feel unfamiliar to an avoidant because they do not create emotional chaos. They create emotional clarity. There is no constant chase, no endless guessing, no dramatic cycle of rejection and reunion. There is simply honesty. And honesty can feel uncomfortable when someone has spent years protecting themselves through emotional distance. Strong boundaries create clarity, allowing avoidant partners to face their own patterns while showing that healthy love requires mutual effort, accountability, and self-respect. The person who transforms an avoidance experience is not the person who becomes impossible to lose. It is the person who becomes impossible to emotionally abandon within themselves. They no longer disappear into someone else's needs. They no longer measure love by how much pain they can endure. They no longer believe that being chosen by another person determines their worth. And ironically, this is often the kind of person who creates the safest environment for real intimacy. Because true connection does not come from two people desperately trying to complete each other. It comes from two people who know themselves, respect themselves, and choose to walk beside each other. The most powerful love is not the love that says, "I will do anything so you never leave." It is the love that says, "I care deeply about you, but I will not leave myself behind to keep you." And it is definitely not the one who spends their energy trying to decode every mixed signal, holding on to the hope that the avoidant will eventually soften with enough patience. In fact, the people who tend to affect avoidance the least are often the very ones who build their entire emotional world around them. Avoidants understand that particular kind of energy instinctively. They know exactly how to survive comfortably inside it. They know how to pull away while still feeling emotionally supplied by someone else's constant, unwavering presence. They know how to disappear without ever truly losing access to that person. But then there exists another type entirely, a quieter type, a much rarer type, an empath who feels everything on a deep level, who sees everything with remarkable clarity, but who never allows that depth to turn into self-erasure. And this is precisely where the dynamic begins shifting in ways the avoidant simply does not anticipate. Because avoidants, whether they realize it consciously or not, are far more comfortable than most people assume when they find themselves at the emotional center of someone else's nervous system. Even when they complain about intensity, even when closeness seems to overwhelm them outwardly, there remains an unconscious familiarity in knowing that the other person will stay emotionally available no matter how inconsistent they themselves become. This creates a hidden layer of safety for them. They can retreat, delay, detach, and grow vague, all while trusting that someone continues emotionally orbiting around them. Someone is still quietly analyzing the silence. Someone is still patiently waiting for their return. That ongoing waiting becomes a fundamental part of the avoidant's sense of control over the relationship. And this is exactly why so many deeply empathic people accidentally end up feeding the very distance they are desperately trying to heal. The more they pursue understanding, the more reassurance they offer, the more they emotionally overfunction within the relationship, the less the avoidant ever has to genuinely confront the consequences of their own emotional withdrawal. But this particular type of empath does something entirely different, something so subtle that at first glance it barely even registers as a reaction at all. They notice the inconsistency clearly. They feel the coldness settling in. They sense the disconnection almost immediately. But instead of panicking outwardly or spiraling into anxious behavior, they turn inward instead. They process everything internally before they ever pursue anything externally. They allow themselves to fully feel what is happening before reacting impulsively. They give themselves permission to register the situation honestly without making the avoidant the immediate regulator of their own emotional distress. And that single internal pause creates the very first crack in the usual predictable pattern. Because now, the avoidance distance is no longer producing the expected flood of anxious texts, lengthy emotional explanations, or desperate attempts at reconnection. Instead, it produces stillness. And stillness happens to be deeply unsettling for someone who has grown accustomed to controlling closeness entirely through withdrawal. Silence carries a psychological weight that words often fail to achieve, especially when that particular silence is not rooted in punishment but in genuine self-containment instead. This empath does not become loud or dramatic in their hurt. They do not rush to make the avoidant understand the depth of the damage simply to extract sympathy or care from them. They simply become more observant, more measured, and noticeably less available in the exact places where they were once overflowing with emotional energy. And suddenly, the avoidant begins feeling something they are genuinely not accustomed to experiencing from the other side of the relationship: real uncertainty. Because emotional certainty is typically what allows avoidants to remain comfortable within a dynamic. The certainty that someone will always remain present. The certainty that someone will continue emotionally translating the relationship for both people involved. Once that certainty starts dissolving, curiosity gradually begins replacing complacency. And curiosity happens to be an incredibly powerful force within avoidant psychology, because avoidants often gravitate toward whatever feels less emotionally engulfing and more emotionally elusive instead. This tends to confuse a lot of people, since they assume that offering more love should naturally create more security within a relationship. But with avoidant patterns specifically, excessive emotional availability can actually strip all healthy tension out of the dynamic entirely. There becomes nothing left to wonder about, nothing at risk of losing, and nothing worth reaching for anymore. But when an empath who once gave endlessly begins becoming more selective with their energy, not cold, not cruel, simply selective and intentional, the avoidant starts sensing that missing emotional access almost immediately. They begin to feel that something is no longer being handed to them effortlessly the way it once was. And scarcity has a peculiar way of making previously invisible things suddenly visible again. This is not some manipulative game being played, because manipulation always carries the underlying vibration of needing a specific outcome to occur, but this particular type of empath is not pulling back in order to force closeness artificially. They are pulling back simply because they are no longer willing to overextend themselves in a situation lacking real reciprocity. Their empathy remains fully intact, but their willingness to abandon themselves does not. The avoidant can genuinely sense when someone is withdrawing purely out of strategy, and they can also sense when someone is simply becoming unavailable to ongoing dysfunction instead. That second scenario lands far deeper within them because it cannot be controlled or manipulated through temporary breadcrumbs anymore. This empath also communicates in a way that feels genuinely disarming to the avoidant. There is no chaotic confrontation involved, no dramatic emotional collapse, no endless circular debates attempting to squeeze certainty out of someone who keeps offering nothing but ambiguity in return. They speak with clarity, and then they simply watch behavior unfold naturally. They understand deeply that affection without any real reliability only creates dependency, never genuine safety. So instead of clinging desperately to verbal reassurance, they quietly observe whether someone's actions actually align with their words. And when those actions fail to align, they adjust their own emotional investment accordingly. That adjustment is precisely what avoidants end up feeling most acutely, the noticeable shift in access they once took entirely for granted. This is usually the exact moment where the avoidant begins leaning forward instead of pulling away. They become noticeably more attentive, more present, and more responsive than before. Not necessarily because they have transformed overnight into a different person, but because they are now genuinely experiencing the loss of emotional access they once had. They begin feeling the absence of all that emotional labor that was quietly sustaining everything behind the scenes: the regular check-ins, the constant softness, the endless patience, the boundless understanding, all the things they quietly benefited from, while simultaneously insisting they needed more space and distance. Now that those things are no longer flowing in at the same steady level, they start feeling the resulting vacuum clearly. But this particular empath's real power does not come from being able to provoke pursuit from the avoidant. It comes from the fact that pursuit is no longer something they need in order to feel anchored within themselves. Whether the avoidant chooses to come closer or not is simply no longer the center of their entire emotional universe anymore. Their peace of mind does not hang precariously from the avoidant's next message. Their sense of worth does not depend on the avoidant's next vulnerable moment. They have fully stepped outside the role of emotional rescuer within the relationship. And once someone genuinely exits that particular role, the entire relationship is forced to reorganize itself around this completely new reality. That shift is what truly brings avoidance to their knees more than anything else ever could. Not punishment, not revenge, and certainly not emotional theatrics of any kind. It is the quiet, deliberate removal of unconditional emotional access that changes everything. It is the exact moment the avoidant realizes they are standing in front of someone who will love deeply, but never endlessly at their own personal expense. Someone capable of feeling genuine pain without ever turning that pain into desperate pleading. Someone who can miss the connection deeply and still choose clarity over chaos every single time. Because in the end, the empath who truly changes an avoidant's entire dynamic is never the empath who loves the loudest or most dramatically. It is the empath who loves deeply enough to finally stop abandoning themselves in the process. And that particular kind of love carries a gravity all its own, a gravity that simply cannot be comfortably taken for granted by anyone. It simply stands there quietly, calm, self-possessed, and fully emotionally awake, silently asking one simple yet powerful question. Will you actually meet me here, in this place of mutual respect and reciprocity? Or will you lose access to me entirely instead? And that happens to be the one question avoidants were never truly prepared to answer.